All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the WGSN-DB Going Solos Veterans Corner. I'm your host, retired Army First Sergeant Paul Holbert. And for those of you that have been watching the show, you know that our format here is to showcase veterans, their families, and their stories, and those programs that assist veterans in their everyday life. So we're going to get to tonight's guest here in just a moment. But first, I want to take just a moment to thank our sponsors. We have two great sponsors for our show. First, Nationwide IT Services. NIS is a service-disabled veteran-owned small business in Fairfax, Virginia, and it's staffed by C.K. Park and his crew. They provide management studies, IT training, professional development, anything that your business could use, his staff can provide. So if you need something for your business, contact CK Park and his group and see what they can do to help you out. I also want to thank Quest Jewelers in Merrifield, Virginia. As most of you know from watching the show, I always tout Pete and Juan Tane's ability to provide you with some of the best quality jewelry that you're going to find, to include custom-made pieces that you may want to have designed. So I strongly encourage you to look at questjewelers.com or give them a call. And if you do, tell them that we sent you from the Going Solo Veterans Corner show. I'm sure he would appreciate hearing that, and they will take care of you. So before we get into tonight's discussion, we have a little different show tonight, one that we've done before, in that I actually have a family member from what is now a deceased veteran. And he is coming on the show tonight to share the story of his father, Benno Silberman, who immigrated to the United States in 1937 and created a life for him and his family here. So before we get into the story, I want to take a moment to welcome his son, Jon Silberman. Jon, welcome, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk about my father's career in the Army and otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really great because you're the second or third guest I've had come on to talk about their family member. And, you know, I really have to respect that and honor that, because I lost my father when I was 5. So I never had the ability to share memories like, you know, you and some of the other guests have shared. So I think it's great for you guys to be able to do that. Now, Jon, I'm not going to get too much into your father's story yet, but I know he was born in Cologne, Germany in 1930, and he immigrated to the United States in 1937 over France. And I know when he came over, there's a story that you have about him not knowing any English around 7 years old. So can you share that with us? What was that like?
Well, my father spoke barely a word of English. Whatever he learned on the HMS Britannica, the ship that took him from France up the East River to Roosevelt Island and then to Williamsburg, Brooklyn. They left him in Williamsburg. Today it's gentrified. Back in 37, it was a total slum. And they dropped my grandparents and my father and my aunt off there. And my father had some cousins that lived in Brooklyn that sponsored him. So my family in Germany was not very religious. We're Jewish, of course. The family in Brooklyn was very religious. So my father gets off the boat with lederhosen and no English. And they tell him, the family tells him, oh, don't send him to public school, send him to a religious school. So they send him the next day to an Orthodox religious school. My father's got blonde hair, even though he's Jewish, you know, he's young, and immediately gets into an argument with the rabbi over his lederhosen, which was inappropriate for the school. And within an hour, my grandfather gets a call, come and pick up your son. He is not suitable for us. So the next day, my father goes to public school. And according to how my father told it, he shows up in school, and in the morning, the Christians beat the crap out of him because he was Jewish. And in the afternoon, the Jews beat the crap out of him because he was German. Yeah. So I said, Dad, how did you deal with that? he told me, I learned how to run fast.
Yeah, I think, you could just imagine a young boy like that coming over here to a strange country and encountering that as part of his, part of his initial experiences. But I know he picked up on English fairly well and got into Brooklyn Polytechnic High School, and, played basketball there in high school. But I think it's kind of interesting that I think your grandfather was a tailor, right?
Yes, my grandfather was a tailor. He was born in Galicia, which was then incorporated at the Peace of Riga after World War I into Poland. And then he emigrated from Poland to Germany, thinking Germany is the cosmopolitan country. I'll be safer there. Turned out to be not the best decision. But yeah, he was a tailor, and he was also, by the way, a member of the International Garment Workers Union. So when he came to America, he got work immediately. He was a very, very accomplished tailor, and his first job was doing dioramas and whatnot at the Brooklyn Museum. And then he saved up enough money eventually to open up his own tailor shop, Michael Silberman Sportswear. And we still have the stickers, the labels that he sewed into the clothing that he sold. And some of my father's clothing that I inherited from him and some of mine have those labels too.
Oh, wow. Well, I know that I see from the information, though, your dad, we understand too. I mean, a lot of people immigrated to the United States back in those early years, and a lot of them, it took a lot for them to set themselves up, do something to make a living for themselves and their family. So, I can understand, because I know your dad, in that situation with your family, like a lot of other immigrant families, there wasn't a lot of money. So I think that was what kind of prompted your father to go into the military, wasn't it? Because he couldn't go to college at the time. And I think that's what drove him into the military.
Right. He had no money for college. My grandparents were unable to assist him in that regard. And so the GI Bill was a godsend to him, as it was to so many others of his generation, to give him a chance to go to college.
Yeah, I hear a lot of veterans, especially, and even today, the GI Bill continues today, but a lot of those older veterans were talking about what a vital program that was for them after they served. Now, your dad went into the Army, and I know there's a story when he was in basic training about you. He had some really bent up fingers, and I think you asked him about it. What did he tell you?
My dad's fingers were always bent. They were kind of like that. He couldn't straighten them out.
Yeah.
Two of his fingers on his right hand. And one day I asked him, Dad, what happened to your fingers? And he said to me, on the second to last day of basic training, I was shooting a machine gun and it recoiled and broke my two fingers. So I went to the medic tent and I asked to have them set. And the medic said, I can set your fingers, but if I do, you will not be able to do the activities you need to on your final day of basic, and you'll have to repeat it. That seemed a bit draconian, but my father's response to that was, hell no, I'm not going back to basic. Just leave the fingers the way they are. And so they healed as they did, and they were bent for the rest of his life.
Yeah, it's, I have to tell you, I've heard stories from other veterans who had similar experiences when they were in basic training. Several of them did get injured, and they really didn't have any choice. They had to go back and were recycled into an earlier basic training brigade. And then there were several that did just like your father and says, well, I'm not going through all this again. I'm going to deal with it the best I can. And, soldier on, so to speak. And it sounds like that's what your dad did. So, it's always interesting to hear these stories about, what you and I would call the old timers, and the hard days people that, just lived those lives that were so full of, while it might have been a good life for them and they enjoyed their lives, were so full of struggle and trying to make a living and and get situated in a new country. So it sounds like your dad was fitting in pretty well.
There was one positive outcome. He was impressed with how the medic treated him, even though he turned down the actual setting of the bones. And he managed to then get himself into the medic corps. So when he was sent to Okinawa and he served there, he was actually in the medic corps. I'm not sure if he was actually a nurse, or probably a nurse's assistant, but that's what he did in Okinawa for most of his Army service.
So what were the dates of his service again?
I should have looked this up beforehand. I'm pretty sure it was 49 to 51.
Okay.
If I'm wrong, it's a year off in one direction or the other.
Okay. So that was just about pre to early Korean War period.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, and that's why I was a little surprised to find out that he ended up in Okinawa. And, I understand that I believe you guys still have some of his old films from his time there.
Yes. My father took all his old 8mm films in Okinawa, and he made a DVD out of them, and he gave them to my brother and myself. And it was really interesting to watch the DVD. I mean, at the time, Okinawa was so primitive, and I'm talking about dirt roads, puddles, and holes in the road, and buildings made of wood, and people all over the street trying to sell you food or little toys or anything they could do to make a living. And my father has videos of himself and his fellow soldiers handing out candies to the little boys who lived in Okinawa. And I think they got a great deal of satisfaction out of that.
Well, he hit Okinawa just post World War II. And I mean, you being pretty read up on history and things of that nature, I'm sure well aware. I mean, that island was just decimated during World War II. So I'm sure it took a long time for it to recover. The other interesting thing is, you just mentioned how your dad and some of his fellow soldiers were handing out candy to the children and doing things like that. It just kind of, it seems like no matter when it is, no matter where you're at, you hear that the story recycles. Because when I was in Desert Storm in Iraq, and especially in Iraq, when we crossed over and spent the time in Iraq, we did, we ran into a lot of Bedouins out in the desert and a few of very small Iraqi towns, and the children would always come running up to us, and we'd toss them bottles of water, we'd toss some candy, anything that we knew. Some of them would even come up and they knew that we had food and MREs, and they would come up and ask for MREs for their family.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it seems like those stories, no matter what time frame it is in the military, just never seem to end, from what your father and his fellow soldiers were doing to what, idea that I know soldiers were doing even, the past few years in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's kind of amazing how things never seem to change, isn't it?
Yeah. I would like to think that some of those little boys grew up and held warm thoughts about the Americans that served on their island, and that has contributed to the warm relations today between Japan and the U.S.
Yeah, I know my wife's brother, who was a career Marine, just retired a couple of years ago. He spent a number of tours on Okinawa, and they really liked it. They liked the people and the duty there. He really enjoyed the island itself. So yeah, I think you're right. I think doing what they were doing kind of planted the seed a little bit a long time ago for the people that followed after them. So I think you're right. I think it was an important thing. Now I know that there was a time when the soldiers who were stationed there got bored and we're looking for creative ways to find other things to do. And I understand that your father found a pretty tricky, creative way to get off the island to go to Japan itself, didn't he?
Well, this is something my father did talk to me about,
Yeah.
that the soldiers on Okinawa were desperate to get to Tokyo, where there was a real nightlife and actually a little bit of action, if you will, from a soldier's perspective. I guess we don't need to go into graphic detail on that. But my father found out that if you were certified as a basketball referee, there were tournaments in Tokyo, and they would be short on refs, and they would ask for refs to come from other parts of Japan and in the Pacific. So he got certified as a referee. And I actually have the clippings that he saved in my paperwork of articles in the Army newspaper about how these refs went from Okinawa to Tokyo, and I see my father's name listed there. So I suppose, having played basketball for Brooklyn Polytech, planted the seed and helped him get a little bit of a more exciting life during his time in the Army in Japan.
Yeah. So did your dad ever share with you, he went in the military, and understandably so, he wanted to take advantage of the GI Bill. And, after we come back from the break here in a few minutes, we're going to talk more about what your father did after he left the military. Mm-hmm. But did he ever give you any indication? Was there something else that prompted him to do his time in the military and leave, or was that his plan all along, or was he not sure?
Well, my father was always very proud of his military service, and as we'll talk about in the next half hour, he continued to work in a field that enabled him to help supply the military. So that was something he did for the rest of his life. I do think the primary impetus was to be able to go to college.
Yeah.
But he learned how to shoot a gun. He hunted later on in his life. And I think he learned a lot of skills. He was very well organized. And he always said that he gained a lot of benefits from his military service.
Yeah. I mean, I think most veterans will definitely tell you that. And, one of the things I think that it did for so many of us was it allowed you to adjust to so many different situations, places, and people. And that seemed to become a very important lesson that I know a lot of us learned. And I think your father was able to apply later on in life, as he left the service and went on to work. So let me just ask you this. This is something I'm going to throw a curveball at you here, Jon. So,
okay.
But do you think there was one particular fond memory your father had of his time in the service that you can think of?
Well, I think his trips, the ones he talked to me about, were the trips to Tokyo.
Yeah.
That was quite an experience for like a 19-year-old German émigré to America to experience.
Yeah.
And just being able to leave, he was very young when he left Germany, and then he landed in America, and they had no money. He couldn't go anywhere. And the Army sent him out into the world and gave him experiences that he would never have had otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, like I said, I think that's true for most of us, because I know when I got in, I was all over the world, seeing all kinds of different things, around all kinds of different people and experiences. So, yeah, I can understand that. It can make a difference. All right, well, Jon, we're going to take a short break here real quick. And folks, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Jon on the WGSN-DB Going Solo Network, Veterans Corner. So let's hear a word from our sponsors. All right. Welcome back, everyone. And you've been listening to the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner. And we've been talking tonight with my guest, Jon Silberman, about his father and veteran Benno Silberman. And Jon, I know when he left the Army, he ended up in Davis and Elkins College in West Virginia.
Right. So that's a Presbyterian school in West Virginia. And that might have been a strange location for a Brooklyn ex-German Jew to be.
Yeah.
But that was yet another opportunity for him to experience different parts of the world.
So just out of curiosity, how did he go from the military coming over, going into the military, and then right out of the military to West Virginia? How did he end up particularly in that school? Was there something about it?
Well, they had, to my knowledge, a very good engineering department.
Okay.
And Dad applied and got accepted, and he wanted to be an electrical engineer. So that's where he went to school. Yeah,
so I know that when he finished there, he got his bachelor's degree in engineering, right?
Yes, he had a BS in engineering. By the way, just as an aside, my mother had a BA and an MS, and she always used to tell my father, "Remember, I have more degrees than you."
Yeah, I can just see that too. You know, I can hear that, the wife telling the husband, and don't forget, I have more than you. Right? That's pretty good. I'm sure. How did he take that?
Oh, he was very proud of her.
Yeah,
he loved it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So he took it all in stride, didn't he?
Very much
so. So he became an engineer, and he went on to work for Raytheon, I believe, wasn't it?
Right. He worked for Raytheon. When he got out of college, he joined Raytheon, and he worked for them straight through to retirement at age 60.
Oh, my gosh. So how old was he when he finished school?
I'd have to guess, actually. 20, 24, 25, maybe.
Okay. All right. So about good 35 years or so he worked for Raytheon.
Right.
And, it's so amazing to, back in those days when you had people that would get with a company. And that was kind of what people did back then. I mean, they get with a company, and that was pretty much their lifelong career, staying until they retired. Yeah. Not like today when we bounce around all over the place, right? From job to job, career to career, or, position to position.
Right.
So I always think it's a testament. Yeah, go ahead.
No, he actually worked for the microwave and power tube division in Raytheon in sales, in the sales department for that division. The division made a lot of different products, but heavy on radar and sonar. And my dad also had some involvement in international sales of the Hawk and Sparrow missiles, but I'll save that for later if you'd like to talk about it.
Well, so let me ask you this. Your dad stayed with Raytheon all those years. Could it have had something to do with the fact of the perk that they gave him a new car every year?
Yeah, every year, because he was in sales, every year he got either a new Chevy Impala or a Ford Galaxy 500.
Yeah.
The best story I have about that is that he actually, by some serendipitous turn of events, got his new car during the year when they had the Northeast blackout, the huge Northeast blackout. And he drove it home that night, and we were in Brooklyn, and every light was out, and you could see the entire stars in the Milky Way like no one had ever seen before. And I don't know that we've seen it again in New York City. And we just went out in his new, whatever it was, Chevy or Ford, I forget what it was that year, and listened to the radio about what was being done to address the situation.
Well, I understood too from talking with you that your father used to also carry all kinds of tubes and things from his job, when he was out on sales. And I think you guys used to play with him.
Well, my father kept his trunk full of, I called them party favors.
Yeah.
Things he would give away to clients as small gifts so that they remember him and try to promote sales. He had always a full complement of all the types of tubes that were common in those days for stereo systems, because all the stereos were, of course, tubes. And, I'm a musician, so we're one of the few groups of people today that still routinely use tubes instead of only transistors.
Yeah.
And I remember, my father got ill with Parkinson's when he was about 80, but when he was about 78 and still sharp, one day I showed him online what the tubes that he used to keep in his car are selling for today on eBay. And he almost fell out of his chair, and he looked at me and he said, "I had no idea I would have kept some if I had known."
Yeah, it seems to always be that way, doesn't it? I still I see some of the vinyl albums, now that they're paying crazy prices for. And I remember when I was younger, I had a stack of those things. And you look back on it and say, well, if I only knew at the time, right? Yeah. And so I know that your dad, your dad also had some interesting times and was able to expose you to some interesting things that he brought from work.
Oh, yes.
Particular one that you guys used at night. Why don't you share that with us?
Okay. I'll start off by saying that it was a different time in the 60s.
Yeah.
And if anyone tried a stunt like this today, you'd probably get a knock on your door from the FBI and locked up the next day. But one day we had a bungalow that we owned in the Catskill Mountains in New York, and we used to go there every summer. And my father would travel back to Brooklyn and work during the week and then come back up on the weekends and meet us. And one Friday he drives up and he says to me, and I believe my brother was there too, "Come, I want to show you what I brought from work today." And it was a night vision scope, a prototype that was being developed for use in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I looked at it. It just looked like a large binocular. So I'm just a kid, maybe 9 or 10. My father takes it out, sets it up in the field, which was black except for stars and maybe the moon, and says, "Take a look through these glasses." And I'm telling you that you could see that field. Everything was green, of course. And maybe today it's not like that, but you could see that field like it was daytime. And all the deer and other animals and birds that were out at night, it made such an impression on me. I've never forgotten it. It was just so astounding to be able to view that. Dad would occasionally bring home other prototypes too. One other one that's interesting is, of course, microwaves had industrial applications, before the mid-'60s, but it was really around the mid-'60s that they started to be developed for home use, for cooking. And of course, Amana, which was owned by Raytheon, developed a product called the Radar Range, which was one of the first, if not the first, home microwaves. And I remember my father brought home a prototype of that, and we put in a cup of water, and a minute later it was boiling, and we just couldn't believe our eyes. And everyone in the neighborhood had to come over and also see it. And of course, a year later, everybody started buying one. But it was just amazing to see something like that. The technology was so new.
Yeah, that's too funny. I can imagine that would be some sight in your neighborhood for something that's new like that no one had seen. So, I can just imagine that. But I want to touch on something now, because I know that you have a tremendous respect for veterans in the military now, and I know you came up in the era of Vietnam, and you sometimes didn't always agree with your dad working for the military, or contractor working for the military. But I think you had shared that seeing your dad like he did and him explaining things to you like he did kind of birthed your own understanding of the military, veterans, and what they do, including your own father when he was in.
Right. Well, there's a very famous quote by Mark Twain. After 4 years of college, I was amazed at how much smarter my father got.
Yeah.
All of us, we think we know everything when we're teenagers and college students, and then we hit the quote unquote real world. And I don't want to say we lose our idealism, but we get a more realistic view of what it takes to raise a family, to protect the country, to defend democracy.
Yeah.
And none of this stuff comes easy or cheap, and somebody has to support it. My father and I had lots of arguments when I was a teenager, especially since I thought I might get drafted to go to Vietnam, about the war and about the military in general, and Eisenhower's statements on the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
And I had long hair and a beard, and I dressed like teenagers or college students dressed then. My father, I think he actually relished some of the arguments we had, because he viewed it as, sharing his point of view and knowledge. And he also always took me with him, probably less than he would have, because I didn't always say yes, but he took me to craft fairs and military shows. And he was always very proud to introduce me to his friends, despite the fact that I looked like a hippie. So I give him a lot of credit for that. And eventually, one day I just said to him, Dad, I really understand what you did and what you're doing, and I really appreciate it and honor it. And I think that made him very happy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can imagine, coming from, his son, after you growing up like you did and all the struggles that he went through, to hear you say something like that, I'm sure it meant quite a bit to him. Now, I know when your dad was in his civilian career and working with Raytheon, he liked to do a lot of other things, and one of the things he enjoyed doing was fishing. And so he did a lot of fishing. But I know there was an interesting episode that he had when he was out fishing in Snake River in Idaho, and he had kind of an unusual, how can you say, camping neighbor on one of his fishing trips.
Yes, and in view of the story I just told you about the politics, it will become even more interesting. But I will tell you that my father loved to fish. Fishing for him was like a Zen Buddhist moving meditation. It enabled him to keep his hands busy and to have some movement and free his mind. And he was I think he was among the happiest times he had in his life was when he was fishing, and he really enjoyed the outdoors. He tied his own lures. He was adamant that they would be barbless hooks on the lures, so that the fish could be put back in and they wouldn't be likely to get infected from being ripped up by hooks with barbs. So he had that environmental thought in mind. One day he went with his good friend Gus, and they hired a guide and a boat, and they went up or down the Snake River fishing. And what they would do is the guide would go up ahead, and he'd tell them what mile marker they'd stop at, what campsite, and the guide would set up the tent and have everything ready, and they would just fish the whole way until they got there. Well, one day they came to their campsite, and my father and Gus see that there's people camping next to them, and they appear to be having a good time. So they thought, why don't we go introduce ourselves? It turns out that the people next door to them were Jane Fonda and her friends, who were also fishing the Snake River. And my dad later learned that Jane Fonda was also an avid fly fisherwoman. So that was a pretty amazing experience. And I would have said, Dad, come on, are you telling me the truth? But he took a picture with her. So I know.
Wow. Oh, that's pretty interesting.
And may I say, she looked beautiful with no makeup on at all.
Yeah, I mean, well, especially back in those younger days, I'm sure she did. But no,
that's father told me as well. He said, she's a very beautiful woman, John.
Yeah. So, or did he say it in the old fashioned? She's a looker, right?
That might have been something that he would say.
So, John, I want to ask you though before we finish the show. It sounds like you've got a really, a lot of really fond memories of your father and respect for what he did. And, just listening to his story, coming over here like he did, not being able to speak English and then, coming in and joining the military and then going to college and having a successful career. It's like we had in the show, and you see on the bottom of your screen, the true American story. And it's a success story that I'm sure you're very proud of. Mm-hmm. But I want to ask you before we wrap up the show, if there was one particular memory or something of your father that you can think of that you would want to share, what would it be?
There are many memories, and what I'm going to share is not a specific incident, but just his relationship with his parents. And I will tell you honestly that my grandfather, my father's father, was shell-shocked. Today we would realize that he had PTSD from what happened to him in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
But he spoke very little. He was not an interactive person, and not very close with my father in some ways. My grandmother was much more effusive and outgoing, but for both of them, my dad did everything he could to be a good son with them, and whatever they needed from him or in any way he could help them, he would always do it, even if he had to drop something else. And that did make an impression on me, and I tried my best to follow in his footsteps.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I can understand that, taking as you get older, taking care of your parents, or, one of the things that unfortunately you don't see a whole lot of anymore like before. So that memory of your father doing just that very type of thing and the respect for his parents, I can imagine, has stuck with you. But yeah. Go ahead.
It just occurred to me that when you mentioned the expression from the 50s, she's a looker.
Yeah.
I will tell you what my dad's expression was for a woman that he thought was attractive. She's a spitfire.
A spitfire. Oh, okay. Yeah, actually, I had heard that used, in movies before, actually. So yeah, she's a spitfire. That would work well. So, John, I just want to share something very quickly before we go, though. And you were talking about earlier being a musician, and I'm sure that if your father was able to see more of what you're doing now, he'd be really proud, because I know that you have your first record, Galvanic Samurai, out, and there
Right.
it is across the screen. And you wrote all of your own songs, you did the music. And the reason why I'm mentioning it is because not only because it's, a really, really good thing for you, but I believe on your next album venture that's coming out in the fall, you actually have written a song that's a tribute to your father on it. Is that right?
Yes, I'll be re-entering the studio in early August to record my second album and possibly my third if we get through enough songs. And I wrote a song that's going to be on my second album for my dad called Self-Made Man, for which I actually have to thank you for the title and the impetus, because one of the early ads that you created for our session together described my father as a self-made man. And he indeed was. And that's not an expression that I had ever used for him before, but it really resonated with me. So it talks about his coming over on the ship from Germany and his early days in Brooklyn, and then becoming successful in raising a family, marrying, having 2 sons, and being a self-made man.
Yeah, that sounds like a good tribute. So I'm glad you shared that. And for those of you that are out there, Jon, very quickly, can you tell us where can they find your album?
Oh, if you look under Jon Silberman, Jon Silberman with a B, and the name Galvanic Samurai, it's on every streaming service there is.
Okay. All right. So if anybody's out there listening and you want to hear a sample of Jon's music, there you go.
Thanks.
So Jon, no, it's so I just thought it was really good, the tribute that you're doing for your father on your next one. So, but Jon, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show tonight and share your father's story with us. It's one, I think, the kind of stories that we need to continue to tell. So I want to thank you very much. And, I'm sure I'll be talking with you again soon.
Thank you very much for having me. My dad would have been so proud to have known that we did this.
Well, you're welcome. And now we'll have the recorded show that you can keep and share with your kids and everything else as well. So thank you, Jon.
Thank you very much, Paul.
All right. And for the rest of our audience that's out there, you know that at the end of each show, we do provide some veteran service or veteran outreach information. And so tonight, I want to make sure we don't forget about our homeless veterans, as there are still many in need. And we always talk so much about how there's an average of 22 veterans committing suicide a day, but there are just thousands and thousands of homeless veterans also that need our help. So for those of you that are able, there's the website up there. There's a number on the Disabled American Veterans webpage that have outreach programs available in different communities. So I encourage you to take a look at some of those and to, do what you can or do what you're led to do for the veterans who are in need. And we understand it's not just veterans who are in this position, but for those of you who have a soft spot for the veterans and feel that you want to help, please do so and check out what you can do on the DAV webpage. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. You were listening to the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner. And for those of you that are veterans and family members out there, again, we want to thank you for your service and all that you've done and that you continue to do, and hope that you are able to live your best life. We hope to see you on our next show, and thank you for watching.